The damage didn't happen in one night. It didn't begin when Natasha Howard buried Dallas in the second half wearing a Minnesota Lynx jersey. And it didn't begin when Aliyah Boston limped toward the locker room while Indiana fans stared at an empty bench with growing panic. The collapse started weeks earlier in offices far away from the cameras, when the Indiana Fever front office convinced itself that letting go of one of the league's best defensive veterans was somehow a smart long-term move. Now the consequences are arriving faster than anyone expected. And every game is starting to feel like evidence against the people running the franchise. Last Thursday night in Arlington, Texas, the entire WNBA got a reminder of exactly what Indiana threw away. Natasha Howard looked nothing like a player nearing the later stages of her career. She looked like a player furious that somebody had underestimated her value. Minnesota was trailing. Dallas looked in control. The Wings had momentum, youth, energy, and a crowd ready to celebrate another statement win. Then Howard completely changed the game. 19 second-half points, 3 blocks, relentless cuts to the rim, defensive stops when the Lynx desperately needed them. Every possession carried the feeling of a veteran taking over a game because she understood exactly when winning basketball matters most. With 51 seconds left, Howard slipped into the paint and touched off a pick-and-roll action and scored the basket that sealed the game. Minnesota escaped with the win. And somewhere nearly 900 miles away in Indianapolis, the Fever front office had to watch a player they let walk dominate another crucial night for a contender. That's the part making this situation feel so brutal for Fever fans. This wasn't some aging role player Indiana quietly moved on from after decline had already begun. Natasha Howard is a 3-time WNBA champion, a former Defensive Player of the Year, a veteran with 12 years of battle-tested experience. Last season, she started every single game for Indiana and delivered one of the most efficient seasons of her career, shooting 55% from the field while anchoring the defense and providing leadership to a young roster trying to grow into contention around Caitlin Clark and Boston. Indiana paid her $214,000 last season. Minnesota signed her for $1.4 million over 2 years, and Indiana decided that was too much to keep. Now suddenly, the Fever are walking into games with one of the weakest front-court rotations in the league, while the exact player who could have solved those problems is thriving somewhere else. It's the kind of roster mistake that looks manageable during off-season press conferences and absolutely catastrophic once real games begin exposing weaknesses every night. Because Howard didn't just bring scoring. She brought protection, physicality, defensive intelligence. She was the player cleaning up mistakes when rotations broke down. The player capable of battling bigger frontcourts so Boston didn't have to absorb every collision herself. The player who allowed Indiana to survive tough stretches when opponents attacked inside relentlessly. Without her, the Fever suddenly looked fragile. That reality became impossible to ignore the moment Boston exited against Washington. Once she disappeared into the locker room with a lower leg injury, Indiana's interior defense completely collapsed. Washington attacked the paint over and over again, finishing at the rim almost uncontested, while Indiana's bench offered no real answer. The Fever were outscored by 30 points inside by a roster filled mostly with rookies and second-year players. That stat alone exposed everything wrong with the current construction of this team. And the timing couldn't be worse, because this isn't just about one injury or one game. It's about a pattern, a dangerous one. Indiana keeps letting experienced players walk away, only to watch them immediately become problems somewhere else. Odyssey Sims already embarrassed the Fever earlier this season after being discarded by the organization. 20 points against her former team. Big shots in the exact building where Indiana once decided she wasn't worth keeping. Then Natasha Howard follows with a dominant performance for Minnesota while Indiana's own frontcourt depth disappears in real time. 3 dates now define this unraveling. April 12th, Howard signs with Minnesota. May 9th, Sims burns Indiana on opening night. May 15th, Boston walks off injured with no backup center waiting behind her. That's not bad luck anymore. That's organizational failure unfolding in sequence. And what makes the situation even more frustrating is that the Fever clearly knew Boston's workload was already becoming a concern. Head coach Stephanie White openly admitted before the season that multiple players were already operating under minutes restrictions and return-to-play management. She practically warned everyone publicly that the roster needed support around its stars. Boston's body was already carrying wear and tear from last season. The coaching staff understood the risk. The front office responded by prioritizing cap flexibility instead of front-court depth. That's the phrase Fever fans are starting to hate more than anything else: flexibility. Indiana deliberately structured Boston's historic contract below the maximum to preserve room for roster construction. The organization sold the idea that sacrificing short-term spending would allow them to build a complete contender around their core. But flexibility for what? To stack more guards onto the roster. To save money while former players thrive elsewhere. To enter critical games with no reliable backup center behind a franchise cornerstone carrying the largest contract in WNBA history. The contradiction is impossible to ignore now. Indiana has one of the most marketable athletes in sports with Caitlin Clark, franchise value exploding. National television attention every week. Sold-out arenas. Massive media exposure. The organization is worth more than ever because of this era of Fever basketball. Yet somehow the actual roster still feels unfinished in the areas that matter most for winning championships. Meanwhile, the rest of the league is moving aggressively. A'ja Wilson got a massive extension because Las Vegas understands championship windows must be protected immediately. Minnesota kept veterans around Nafisa Collier because proven experience wins playoff games. Dallas rebuilt aggressively with elite draft picks and veteran support pieces. Indiana had the Defensive Player of the Year on a bargain contract after winning the Commissioner's Cup with her contributing heavily, and they let her leave. Now Wednesday night is approaching, and the pressure surrounding the Fever suddenly feels enormous. The Portland Fire are arriving in Indianapolis as an expansion team built from cast-offs, rookies, and overlooked veterans. On paper, Indiana should overpower them easily. But basketball games are not won on paper. They're won in matchups, rotations, and physical battles inside the paint, exactly where Indiana suddenly looks weakest. Boston's health hangs over everything. Clark continues carrying impossible expectations every night. And somewhere in Minnesota, Natasha Howard is preparing for another season with a contender while Indiana tries to convince everyone its missing frontcourt depth isn't a crisis. But Fever fans can see it now. The empty bench, the exhausted stars, the defensive breakdowns, the former players thriving elsewhere. The pattern has become impossible to deny. This isn't about one decision anymore. It's about a franchise trying to build a championship while ignoring the ugly realities of what championship basketball actually requires. And the terrifying part for Indiana is that the consequences are only beginning, because eventually Caitlin Clark will have her own long-term negotiations with this franchise. Eventually, the Fever will ask the face of women's basketball to trust them with the prime years of her career. They'll ask her to believe they can build a championship roster around her. They'll ask her to commit fully to Indianapolis as the centerpiece of the league's future. And right now, the evidence supporting that trust looks thinner every single night. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dive coverage on the biggest stories in basketball. And let me know in the comments, did the Indiana Fever make the biggest mistake of the offseason by letting Natasha Howard walk away? Should the front office make an emergency move before this season spirals further out of control? Or is the damage already done?